Good morning, my dear students. In this lecture today, we will discuss about the very first chapter, that is, A Triumph of Surgery from the book Footprints Without Feet, which is written by James Herriot. The chapter, A Triumph of Surgery, is about a pampered dog, Tricky, who is overfed and does not exercise at all, and therefore falls ill. The doctor and the writer of the story, James Herriot, takes the dog to his surgery, where he recovers slowly but surely. Now let us see in detail what happens in A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Herriot. James Herriot, a veterinarian doctor, narrates the story of Tricky the dog and how he gets better. He saw Tricky one day with his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey. James was shocked to see Tricky's appearance. He was seriously overweight and had bloodshot eyes. Mrs. Pumphrey quickly explained that she thought Tricky was suffering from malnutrition, so she fed him some malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks. She also confessed that she fed him some cream cakes and chocolate. James realized the situation was bad. He knew Tricky could never say no to food because he was very greedy. So he gave the lady some stern advice to control Tricky's diet. But James was sure that Mrs. Pumphrey would not follow his instructions. However, as he watched Mrs. Pumphrey walk away with Tricky, he thought it wouldn't be long before he heard from her. Sure enough, Mrs. Pumphrey called a few days later. It seemed Tricky was refusing food and was suffering from bouts of vomiting. James had already made a plan by then. He knew that the only way to cure Tricky was to get him away from the house and into his clinic. So he came to Mrs. Pumphrey's house and suggested Tricky be removed to his clinic for 2 weeks. Mrs. Pumphrey almost fainted at this suggestion. But the narrator was firm. Grabbing hold of Tricky, James carried him down to his car. The whole household was in an uproar. The staff rushed about getting blankets, balls, clothes, and toys for Tricky. The narrator, realizing the items would not fit in his car, quickly drove away from there. But from his rear view mirror, he saw the entire household standing on the road in tears. At his clinic, his dogs came rushing to him. Tricky, in contrast, just stared at them with dull eyes. For the next 2 days, Tricky was given only water and no food. At the end of the second day, Tricky started showing some interest in his surroundings. On the third day, the narrator led Tricky to the dogs playing in the yard. Tricky slowly followed the dogs around as they played. Later, after the dogs were fed, Tricky sniffed their balls, licking them casually. The next day, when a ball was set for him, Tricky joined the other dogs for his meals. And that was the turning point for Tricky. From then, he made a rapid progress. He ran around with the dogs, fighting them for food and hunting rats at night. On hearing that, Mrs. Pumphrey started bringing around baskets of eggs for Tricky. Then she started sending wine, but James knew that such type of things were harmful for Tricky, so he himself started consuming those items. Lunch became a fun affair with glasses of wine before and during the meal. Finally, Mrs. Pumphrey sent a bottle of brandy. James and his partner reverently enjoyed this drink at the dinner. James was tempted to keep Tricky permanently, if only for the fine spirits, that is wine and brandy and lots of eggs. But he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering. So he called her and gave her the good news of Tricky's recovery. Within minutes, Mrs. Pumphrey arrived at the clinic. There was a marked change in Tricky now. No longer was he a fat, bloated animal. Now he was agile and well-muscled and kept up well with James' dogs. James carried Tricky back to Mrs. Pumphrey's car. The minute Tricky saw his owner, he jumped out of James' arms and rushed at Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey tried to defend herself as Tricky barked and licked her face. Mrs. Pumphrey, with tearful eyes, thanked Mr. James. She believed it was a triumph of surgery. So, dear students, this is all about the story of the chapter, A Triumph of Surgery. Now you try to write the summary of this chapter in your own words. In the next lecture, we will discuss about some important topics from this very first chapter, from Footprints Without Feet. Till then, stay home, save lives. Thank you very much and namaskar.